Welcome to the IVF Journey with Dr. Michael Chapman, the podcast for couples who struggle with infertility and want to fulfill their dreams of becoming parents. In this podcast, you'll learn actionable strategies to deal with infertility from Dr. Michael Chapman, or Prof as he's affectionately known. Prof is the co-founder of IVF Australia and is a leading Australian infertility specialist who has helped over 3,000 couples realise their dreams of becoming parents. To access previous episodes packed with ideas, solutions and tips that actually work, head over to Dr. Chapman's IVF podcast on iTunes. You can also ask questions by contacting Dr. Chapman's rooms on 1800 111 483 or by emailing him michael.chapman@ivf.com.au.
That first cry of a baby born after the long journey of IVF remains one of the most beautiful experiences in the world. As an obstetrician and an IVF specialist, I've had the privilege of experiencing this over many thousands of times in my long career, but I still remain moved by each baby's first cry. It signifies the end of a long journey and the beginning of a new life. This is Professor Michael Chapman, co-founder of IVF Australia and host of the IVF Journey podcast. Thanks for tuning in. To access all the previous episodes, head over to my website, www.theivfjourney.com, and select IVF Journey Podcast from the navigation menu. You'll also be able to find the various services that we provide at IVF Australia. Today we're going to talk about the lining of the womb in an IVF cycle. Why is it important? Can it be abnormal? What is normal? Lots of questions. So let's start with what happens in nature. In a normal menstrual cycle, under the effect of the estrogen that's produced by the ovary, the cells in the lining of the womb gradually grow and multiply, and the lining of the womb becomes thickened. That proliferation of the endometrium, the lining of the womb, is preparing itself to be a bed into which the embryo will snuggle up later in the cycle. That lining reaches somewhere between 5 and 7 millimeters in thickness around the time of ovulation. It doesn't thicken much beyond then. However, it does undergo huge changes over the few days after ovulation. These changes are caused by the release of progesterone from the corpus luteum, which is basically the remnants of the follicle where the egg came from. That progesterone acts upon the lining of the womb, the cells within the endometrium, and makes them change their structure and their function. It turns some of the cells into glandular tissue, glands, and glands secrete substances. They secrete mucus, but they also secrete lots of goodies which will nourish the embryo when it arrives in the womb around day 5 to 7 after ovulation. That change in the lining of the womb is absolutely essential to get attachment of the embryo and implantation of the embryo and establishing a pregnancy. Indeed, it's now quite clear that in that window between 5 and 7 days after ovulation, the lining has to be a particular shape, a particular chemical formula, a particular pattern of secretion to enable a pregnancy to occur, called the implantation window. And if an embryo arrives in the uterus either before that implantation window or is delayed and arrives late, then pregnancy won't occur. We believe that may be a problem in natural conception that causes infertility, is an abnormal second half of the cycle, an abnormal luteal phase. In an IVF cycle, we give the drugs to make multiple follicles with estrogen levels that are far, far higher than in a natural cycle. Those very high estrogen levels stimulate the lining of the womb to grow much more, to get thicker than in a normal cycle. It is not unusual in an IVF cycle to see thicknesses on ultrasound of the lining of the womb being between 9 and 12 millimetres. We even see them up to 14 or 15 millimetres. And that explains why at the end of an IVF cycle, if pregnancy doesn't occur, it is often a very heavy period because that lining is so thick compared with nature. We also know that a very thick lining is associated with a reduced pregnancy rate. So you can be too thick. The other end of the spectrum is a lining that's too thin. Again, we know that pregnancies rarely occur when the endometrium around the time of implantation is less than 4 millimetres in thickness. It may be a cause of infertility in natural cycles to have too thin an endometrium. But we certainly know in IVF cycles, when we put an embryo back and the endometrium is less than 4 millimetres, pregnancy rates are substantially reduced. Even 5 millimetres is debatable. By 6 millimetres, we're happy, but if you're getting a 6 millimetre endometrium and you've had lots of follicles, it still raises a question of whether the lining of the womb is in top class condition. The causes of a thin lining are basically unknown. It may be, in rare cases, due to a previous curette of the uterus that has taken away the basal levels of the lining of the uterus or caused scarring through the muscle of the uterus. But that's rare. A thin lining with no obvious cause happens in IVF cycles, probably 1 in 100 cases. What we do in that scenario would be to freeze all the embryos rather than put any of them back in an environment which is unlikely to produce a pregnancy. If we're doing frozen embryo transfers, we always check the lining of the womb to make sure it is over 6 millimetres in thickness. If we find that the lining of the womb is less than 4 millimetres, we try various things, various regimes, various drugs to try and improve the lining of the womb, at least in terms of its thickness. Unfortunately, none of them have really been shown to be of significant benefit. But the first thing we do is to augment the estrogen levels in the mother. By that, we are going to give estrogen tablets or estrogen gel to the skin, and hopefully those higher estrogen levels will promote more endometrial growth, more growth of the lining of the womb. After that, people have tried drugs that increase the blood flow of the uterus. Viagra has been used in that scenario. But again, randomized controlled trials don't show any specific benefit. In a frozen cycle, the other option to increase estrogen levels is to stimulate multiple follicle growth, a bit like the fresh IVF cycle. Again, in women who have this rare condition of a thin endometrium, still usually do not respond. So it is a difficult problem. Pregnancies are still seen in thin endometrium, but they are less likely to occur. The other option, if that's a recurring failure of thickening up the lining of the womb associated with putting embryos back and not getting pregnancies, is to use a surrogate to transfer the embryos to another woman's uterus that is normal. It's a fairly drastic step, but it may be the only one possible in this group of patients. And don't forget that you can access all the previous episodes by going to our website, www.theivfjourney.com, and select IVF Journey podcast from the navigation menu.
Thank you for listening to the IVF Journey with Dr. Michael Chapman, the podcast which helps couples negotiate their way through the IVF journey, all the way to parenthood. You can also ask questions by contacting Dr. Chapman's rooms on 1800 111 483 or by emailing him michael.chapman@ivf.com.au.